For most of her political career, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni hasn't been a massive fan of the European Union. Her Brothers of Italy party previously advocated for leaving the Eurozone and amending Italy's constitution to give domestic law priority over European law. And as recently as 2019, Meloni herself was calling to, quote, bring down the European Union. In this light, Meloni's election victory in 2022 triggered a fair bit of anxiety in Brussels, where European leaders worried that having an ardent Eurosceptic at the head of the EU's third largest economy would give way to political dysfunction. However, since taking office, Meloni has taken a remarkably pragmatic stance towards the EU, and at last week's Rimini meeting, she apparently threw her weight behind the idea of a more geopolitically agile EU, calling for a European army and warning that the EU is doomed to geopolitical irrelevance unless it finds a way to respond to the dual threats of China and the US. So in this video, we're going to explain Meloni's idea of a Europe that does less but better, and whether it could actually happen. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine Too Long. Yep, we make a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Europe can really defend itself, why people like Putin get away with it, and whether we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. So let's get straight into it. The first thing to make clear here is that when Meloni talks about a more geopolitical EU, she isn't simply calling for a more federal Europe with more power in Brussels. Rather, Meloni wants to, quote, move beyond the somewhat stale debate between more Europe and less Europe, and instead move towards a Europe that, in Meloni's words, does less and does it better. This notion of less but better is the central idea behind Meloni's vision for the EU. Whereas Europhiles generally want to transfer ever more power from nation states to the EU, and Eurosceptics want to transfer ever more power from the EU back to nation states, Meloni wants to pave a sort of third way in between the two, taking the EU out of certain policy areas so that they can do more in others. In practice, this would basically mean a clearer division of powers between the European Union and its member states. For context, under the Lisbon Treaty, the EU's powers, or competences, are currently split into three groups. Exclusive competences, like the customs union and monetary policy, where the EU has total legislative power. Shared competences, like the internal market, environmental policy and energy policy, where the EU and member states essentially legislate together. And supporting competences, like tourism, education and culture, where member states have primary responsibility, but the EU can lend a hand if needed. Broadly speaking, Meloni seems to want the EU to focus less on most of the shared and supporting competences, especially when it comes to things like the environment, education and culture, which Meloni thinks should be left entirely up to nation states, and focus more on its executive competences, while taking up a bit more responsibility when it comes to certain shared competences. In her speech, for instance, Meloni argued that the EU should be more responsible for the continent's security, and has long advocated for deeper European cooperation on defence. And this reflects the Italian public's opinion. Data from March found that 65% of Italians are in favour of a common European army, and just 15% are against it. Meloni's position here is also probably informed by Italy's fiscal position. In short, funding one larger European army would be more cost-effective than funding 27 national armies, which makes it an attractive option for cash-strapped countries like Italy, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 138% and is struggling to meet NATO's new 5% spending target. This is an argument made explicitly by one of Meloni's MEPs and ECR co-chair Nicola Procaccini earlier this year, when he told the European Parliament that with a European army, quote, we can spend less overall, do more, and do it better. And that more generally, the EU shouldn't try to do everything, but should try to do a few very important things. Alongside security, the other areas where Meloni wants the EU to do more is immigration. This is essentially because, as long as there's freedom of movement inside the EU, migration policy only really works if it's implemented at the EU level. Even if Italy, for instance, tightens up its borders, immigrants could just enter Italy via some other member state with more relaxed border controls. Already, Meloni has played a leading role in shaping the EU's new migration policy, pulling the continent rightwards. Perhaps most notably, she apparently convinced the Commission of the merits of offshore asylum processing, and late last year, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen sent a letter to other EU heads of state endorsing the idea of offshore processing, and even citing Italy's deal with Albania as an exemplar. Meloni has also played a conspicuous role in helping von der Leyen negotiate EU-wide migration deals with countries like Tunisia and Egypt. You get the idea. Meloni apparently wants the EU to do less, but not because she necessarily opposes the idea of European cooperation, but rather because she hopes that, in narrowing its focus, the EU will be able to, quote, do better. Now, we should note that this isn't necessarily a new idea. The European Conservatives and Reformists, or ECR group in the European Parliament, which includes Meloni's Brothers of Italy party, has been talking about something along these lines for years, which they often describe as Euro-realism. But most other self-described Euro-realists in the ECR generally want the EU to do less, and are less interested in the better part. In other words, they're just rebranded Eurosceptics. Meloni, on the other hand, does genuinely seem to want the EU to do more in certain areas, especially security and immigration, which both marks her out from the rest of the ECR and makes her proposal more realistic. After all, plain old Euroscepticism, even if it's rebranded, is a tough sell when there's a pretty widespread consensus in Europe that the EU needs to develop its own strategic autonomy to respond to the dual challenges of China and the US. So could this actually happen, or is this just another pro-European pipe dream that will ultimately be suffocated by Brussels bureaucracy? Well, maybe, but it does at least feel like Meloni's notion of an EU that does less but better has a wider appeal. While it might not be as expansive as Macron's vision for strategic autonomy, proponents of strategic autonomy should recognise that the EU is indeed too thinly spread to act with geopolitical agility. But that's not all. Meloni's ideas should also appeal to Europeans that recognise the EU needs to reform in order to maintain geopolitical relevance, but are nonetheless wary of any Macronite ideas that sound too much like a United States of Europe. Now, when you're diving into complicated topics such as this, it's quite easy to get caught up in what you know without even missing a beat. But what about the stories you don't see? Or what happens when the stories you do see are purposely leaving out information to try and sway your thinking? Thankfully, our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at helping with just that. That's because Ground News is a website and app that collects thousands of articles from across the world and puts them all in one place for you to easily compare how the news is being covered by different outlets online. For each and every story, you can see the number of sources reporting on it, as well as the political bias, factuality, and ownership of said sources. For example, if we take this story on Meloni's Rimini speech, you can see that there are 23 sources reporting on it, with 7 of them coming from the left and 2 coming from the right. You can even compare the headlines to see what either side is saying, with the left focusing on the civilian death toll in Gaza, in contrast to the right, which is focused specifically on the killing of journalists. That's not all though. Ground News has tons of super handy features, and our personal favourite is their blind spot feed. Here you can find stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, helping you challenge your perspective on someone else's media reality. Here at TLDR, we're passionate about helping you understand how bias may affect the media you consume, something that Ground News also firmly believes in. Because of this, we're offering 40% off their unlimited access Vantage Plan subscription if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen. You can only access this discount through our link, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.